to try and sum up the essence of history in the next 45 minutes or so. I might do it in a couple of bursts if it's useful for me to give people an opportunity to ask questions and make comments, but I want to give you the essence of the historical process in 45 minutes. And there's a reason for doing this. Could you swap the slide? It's Bridget, isn't it? Yes, okay. I'm going to explain first of all why it matters, why we need to understand history. Because history is not predetermined. What happens is shaped by what human beings do. The future will be determined by what we do in this epoch. And we are now facing the biggest crisis in the history of the capitalist system since it began. We are now 5 years into the Second Great Depression, and we don't know what the outcome of the Second Great Depression is going to be, but that's how serious it is. I suspect it's rather worse than the First Great Depression. Next slide, please, Bridget. And if you look at images of the First Great Depression from 1929 to 1940, essentially when it ended, the images of the First Great Depression look very similar to some of the images now being generated by the Second Great Depression. It is the case in Greece that living standards have fallen by about a third. It is the case in Greece that the levels of unemployment there are now comparable with the levels of unemployment when Hitler came to power in Germany. When there is a crisis, an economic crisis which tears society apart, the centre, the political centre, does not hold, and extreme solutions become necessary. And different kinds of extreme solutions are possible, different kinds of outcome are possible. The Great Depression was ended by the Second World War and by rearmament. It was ended by Stalingrad, Auschwitz, and Hiroshima. It was ended by barbarism. Next slide, please, Bridget. And that outcome was not inevitable, because during the 1930s, in the depths of the crisis, there was a struggle taking place across Europe to determine what kind of future it was going to be, what kind of outcome there was going to be to the 1930s. The question of revolution or war, socialism or fascism, socialism or barbarism, was posed on the historical agenda of Europe, and the outcome was determined by what millions of people did. In Spain, between 1936 and 1939, there was a full-scale civil war between the left and the right won it. The fascists won it, just as they had won across Europe, and that determined, that ensured that revolution, socialism, that alternative went down to defeat, and we ended up with fascism and war, the worst war in human history, with 60 million dead. Next slide, please. So those were the two alternatives. The revolution represented by Spain in 1936, or the barbarism represented by Nazism at the same time in 1936. Incidentally, just a little comment on the Olympics. Do you know the origins of the Olympic torch? It was invented in 1936 by the Nazis because they thought it would be a good idea to link the Aryan master race that was now in power in Berlin with classical antiquity. So they arranged for a flame to be lit in Olympia in Greece, carried across Europe, and then brought into the new Berlin stadium that had been constructed to celebrate the games. So don't let anybody try and persuade you that sport is not political. Sport is highly political. The London 2012 games are highly political. The Olympic torch is highly political. There's a little symbol, if you like, of the barbarism of the 1930s. Next slide, please. So we need to understand how history works, because what we do matters. because what millions of people do over the next few years will determine the outcome of the second Great Depression. I put this image up because it's a wonderful representation done by an Italian artist in 1901 that depicts the common people, that depicts the masses, and what the masses do, what ordinary people do, what thousands of activists and tens of thousands of activists and ultimately, hopefully, hundreds of thousands of activists do to lead millions to a better future. What they do will determine whether that is the outcome, which we see in the next 5 years or 10 years or 15 years in response to the crisis that we face. We're going to talk quite a lot about the role of ordinary people in making history. Next slide, please. But I want to give you some building blocks for understanding the historical process. To understand the historical process, you need to be aware that there is structure. There is always structure. There's an economic structure. There's a social structure. There's a political structure. And that structure that is imposed upon us, that we live within, that we grow up inside, that we work as part of, imposes constraints on us, and also at the same time creates opportunities, but it does not create inevitabilities. The structure is there, limiting, but also at the same time enabling. And you don't get history unless you understand that as well as structure, there is also, next slide please, there is also agency. And I've represented agency here by showing you a page from a newspaper produced in the French Revolution, a photograph of one of the leaders of the Russian Revolution, a picture of the American Civil War, a picture of the Egyptian Revolution, a picture of the Civil Rights Movement. Dr. Martin Luther King is in the picture, and a picture from a recent anti-austerity protest in Britain. All of those are examples of agency. They are examples of people organising themselves to determine what sort of world they were going to live in. Let's just focus on one example for a moment, just to explain what I mean. Let's take the civil rights movement in the United States, in the southern states of America, in the 50s and the 60s. One day in 1955, Rosa Parks sat down in a whites-only seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. On that day, Rosa Parks had finally had enough. She'd had enough of the racism. She'd had enough of the police violence against black people. She'd had enough of the Ku Klux Klan and their campaigns of terror. She had had enough of the discrimination. She'd had enough of black people being dumped in second-rate jobs, in third-rate jobs, or dumped on the dole. She'd had enough of the institutionalized racism that poisoned life in the southern states of America. And by making that decision on that day, she detonated the civil rights movement. And by its end, millions of Americans, black Americans and white Americans who supported them, had mobilized against police violence, against state violence, against the violence of racist thugs, and had smashed racism in the southern states of America. Or at least the institutionalized racism that had characterized that part of the world for 100 years since the end of the Civil War. What Rosa Parks did, and what thousands of other black activists did, and ultimately what tens of thousands of black and white activists did to mobilize ordinary Americans against racism, changed the face of America. What people do matters. That's what shapes history. And there wouldn't have been the election of a black American president, but for Rosa Parks. That's the truth of it. Next slide, please. There is structure, which imposes constraints, which shapes how we operate in the historical process, and there is agency, and we are the agents of history. I say we, I'm 54, which means I'm not a particularly effective agent of history anymore. And that's because history is made by the young. The average age of the crowd which stormed the Winter Palace and brought down the Tsar in October 1917 was 19.
Wow, good on that.
That's normal. The average age of the people who make revolution, who fight wars, who engage in great class struggles, tends to be very, very low indeed, which is why it was such a wonderful thing to see and to be part of when the student revolt exploded at the end of 2010 onto the streets of London. So I'm glad I'm addressing a very young audience. It's nice to be possibly the oldest person standing in this field right now. Is that true? Is there somebody older than me in this field right now? You are all potentially agents of history. Next slide, please. Okay, we've got two concepts to play with, the idea of structure and the idea of agency. And structure and agency interact in relation to three motors of the historical process. Three things that drive history. One of them is technology. I represent it with this cartoon. It's represented also, by the way, by my two objects, or my two sets of objects. This object represents the beginning of history, the beginning of time. It is a Paleolithic hand axe. It's an old Stone Age hand axe. I can't tell you whether it's 50,000 years old or 2.5 million years old. It could be either, because they made them like that 2.5 million years ago, and they were still making them like that 50,000 years ago. So don't let anybody ever tell you that progress is inevitable. Progress sometimes happens, but for a lot of the time it doesn't. That represents the cutting edge of technology for most of the time that hominids, human beings of one kind or another, have been on the planet. And these are my objects representing the modern industrialized world in one of its more barbaric forms, of course, because these are Second World War protection against aerial bombing and the possibility of chemical warfare, the possibility of gas attack. If you like, this represents the end of history, and the two sets of objects are telling us that an accumulation of knowledge, an accumulation of technique, is a fundamental feature of the historical process. We get progressively better as human beings at creating the goods and services that we need in order to make life decent, though sometimes that technology can be turned into means of destruction. Human emancipation is possible through technology, but so too is the destruction of humanity through its barbaric use in war. Technology is one of our drivers, one of our motors. Next slide, please. There's another example, the example of the plough. The invention of the heavy plough, which cut deeply into the sod, turned over the soil, brought deeply buried nutrients to the surface, transformed the productivity of agriculture in the medieval period. Once the common people had learnt this technique, once the common people, the working people, knew how to make a heavy plough, once they knew how to work the land in this way, they never forgot it, because you never go back to a more difficult, a less productive, a less efficient way of working. Technology and the accumulation of knowledge and know-how and science and technique is one of the motors of the historical process, one of the drivers. Next slide, please. Here's the second, or a second. They're not in any particular order. It is the competition between different groups of rulers.